Welcome, everybody. I've got a really exciting podcast for you. We've got a guest expert, arguably one of the smartest people I know. And quite frankly, I'm excited to learn even more from him. We've got Joss Mottershead. Now, Joss, let me get out of the way. If you could tell our listeners more about yourself and what you do, and the information that you're going to be bringing is super important. So I want people to also know where they can find.
Well, I'm not sure about being one of the smartest people you know. That's a little bit scary, or perhaps says something about your friends. I'm not sure. But a lot of people out there on the internet know me, or more specifically, the website equinereproduction.com with a hyphen in between equine and reproduction, because we've been out there since 1999, putting out information about the equine reproductive process. And some of you will have done our courses as well. We give the courses. And then in addition, we have a Facebook group, which has over 55,000 members worldwide that discusses equine reproduction. So for those of you that don't know me, that's a little bit of a background. What we do in the way of business here is we have a breeding operation. We breed. We are a veterinary clinic that specializes in specifically equine reproduction. And we breed somewhere around up to about 300 mares a year or something like that. And we stand about 17 stallions, up to about 17 stallions, free semen, do embryo transfers, things like that. So we've seen a fair variety of things over the years, which can be good or bad, depending on what it is you're seeing on any given day. It's usually always interesting. And we ourselves, my wife and I, Kathy St. Martin, who works with me in the business, we also have a warm blood breeding operation. So again, we've been in that game for many years too. So we've seen a variety of things going. As far as what we're going to do today, we're going to talk a little bit about the hormones of the mare, which is something that a lot of people struggle with, but actually has tremendous import as far as actually managing. And similarly associated with that, just how to manage the hormones in some of those mares to manipulate them and maybe make your breeding life easier.
No, that's exciting. Before we begin, I did have a question that popped up. Like you said, it's kind of misunderstood. Do you think that's just from the standpoint of the lack of education that's out there, or just that there's so much misinformation that's out there?
Well, I always like to title it myth information because there are a lot of myths out there associated with hormones and just misunderstandings too. And a lot of that stems from historical experience that people jump to make an assumption on something, as well as just general lack of knowledge. But the equine reproductive field is exciting because it's advancing all the time and new things are being discovered. And some of the old dogma that's been kicking around for years and years, it turns out really isn't quite as true as we always thought it was. So maybe we'll shoot down a few of those myths as well.
Yeah, and I hope in that process that some of our listeners don't get offended, but they just become more empowered when they hear, the science behind what we're bringing. Because most people are like, well, we've been doing this for years and years and years, and we've had no issues, and it's because of this thought process. So when we have this kind of a clash of thinking, some people tend to get really inflamed.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be a dicey thing educating at times because you certainly do run into well, we've always done it this way, and the response to that was, well, if it works for you, that's great, but research suggests that perhaps it either isn't the best way to do it, or there's more to it than that, or there may even be downsides on what you've been doing that you're not necessarily. So one has to walk a fine line between educating and insulting, as you say. And we certainly don't want to insult anyone, of course, that's not the aim. But hopefully everybody will go away with a little bit more information than what they already have. That would be pretty exciting if we could do that.
Yeah. So let's get started. Let's start with just understanding kind of the hormonal cycle of the mare, just as an introduction or an overview.
Exactly. Yeah. Let's move on into that and go. A lot of people get a little bit overwhelmed by the hormones and don't understand what they do or when they do it or why they do it. So having a better understanding of that certainly makes it worthwhile to look at this in more. Hopefully we won't bore everybody to death and they turn off and disappear before we get going. But let's take a look at our first slide and see what's coming up in a second. We have the two hormones, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, at least hope. Let me know when you can. Well, we can go with that one too. Works.
Which one did you want to see?
We can start there. That's fine. So what we're going to look at here is between day 0 and the day of ovulation there, that first vertical orange line, and the next day 0, as it were, the other ovulation there, you're looking at approximately 21 days. And thankfully, most mares did read that page in the guide. So 21 days is an average. You'll see a variation by maybe a day or two in some mares. If you see a significant reduction in the interovulatory period, so if you see a mare that is ovulating maybe every 15 or 16 days or even less, that should ring alarm bells right off the bat for you. We're sort of straying off topic already, but that can suggest that the mare has something irritating her uterus. And we'll learn a little bit more here in a moment as to what it could be doing. But the end result is that it brings the mare back into estrus earlier than it'd be. And that's something that's irritating the uterus is usually going to be pathogen. That's the most common item that's going to cause that. So we'll talk more about that in a second. So the intraovulatory period on average around 21. And as we can see, looking at the red line, progesterone, that is the hormone that is prevalent for the majority of that entire estrous cycle period from ovulation to ovulation. And progesterone is a hormone that is a progestational hormone. And there are various word threads that make it a little bit easier to try and remember what these functions of these various hormones are. So it's a progestational hormone. So it's going to produce an effect that is either supportive of pregnancy or mimics pregnant-like behaviors. So one of the good pregnant-like behaviors is resisting a stallion's. Obviously, the last thing you want if you're a pregnant mare is a stallion to come trotting along and hop on and try and breed you. So a really good way to prevent that is by kicking him in a very uncomfortable place, and that discourages stallions very rapidly. And that's progesterone. And progesterone is a very, very scary hormone from a male perspective. It can be very bad. So progesterone causes the resistance of the stallions. It also encourages the closure of the cervix and toning of the reproductive tract, which again are both important functions in pregnancy, obviously, to maintain the pregnancy, especially during the early. And finally, rather interestingly, progesterone suppresses the uterine immune response. And progesterone is a member of the group of hormones known as progestins. And progestins as a whole also suppress the uterine immune response. But from our perspective right now, with a mare that's not yet been bred, that raises a very important point, because if we were to inseminate a mare when she is under the influence of progesterone, we could end up with a very unfortunate set of circumstances, because we're going to introduce things in there beside. We can't really avoid it. No matter how clean we are, we're always going to introduce other things in there we're eating. And if you do that when there's no immune function going on in the uterus, then those other things, typically being bacteria, are going to party very quickly. So you want to avoid doing that. So towards the end of what's called the diestrus period, that period of time when the mare is not in heat, we see that red line take a nosedive. And just before it starts its nosedive, we see a spike of another hormone called prostaglandin F2 alpha, abbreviated PGF2A very often. And prostaglandin F2 alpha actually destroys the item which creates the progesterone. And the progesterone is secreted from a structure on the ovary called the corpus luteum. And so the prostaglandin destroys the functionality of the. Some of you may have used hormonal manipulation product called Lutelice, and you might have wondered why it has such a weird name as Lutelice. And the reason is, there you go, there's your Lutelice bottle. The reason is that it's actually lysing the corpus luteum, hence the name Luteum. So we see that destruction of the corpus luteum, and then we see the associated nosedive of progesterone. And during that time frame of 2 or 3 days, if a stallion is being teased by a mare, she'll go from actively resisting the stallion to sort of a ho-hum attitude, not really sure whether she wants to encourage him or whether she is still somewhat resistant to him. And then after a day or two, she's going to start becoming actively receptive to the stallion, at least we hope. And that is in response to another hormone that we can see there with that blue line, estrogen. And estrogens are secreted by the follicle itself, the developing follicle, which is ultimately going to go on and ovulate. And the estrogens sort of work in the opposite direction to progesterone in that it encourages receptivity to the stem. It also promotes blood flow to the uterine environment, which in turn increases the immune response in the uterine. Because remember that breeding is not a particularly clean process. Even when we're very, very careful about it, we still end up with unpleasant things in there. So you want a major immune response reaction to the breeding process itself, and that's encouraged by that estrogenic level. And then finally, another very important function of estrogens is it encourages relaxation of the reproductive tract, including, of course, the cervix. And if you're a stallion that's going to breed hair, then relaxing that cervix is going to enable the passage of both the penis in some cases and certainly the semen into the uterus, which is where it needs to be to proceed towards the oviducts to achieve actual fertility. So those are the immediate main hormones that we talk about the most. A couple of others that are shown there are follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. And in this diagram, we can actually see the brown line, the FSH, has a biphasic action. It's got two waves. And that's rather interesting because the mare, unlike a lot of other species, obviously will respond, as other species do, to the increased levels of FSH with follicular waves. But unlike the other species, when the mare produces the follicular waves, she may actually even go ahead and ovulate on a diestrous ovulation when she's under the influence of progesterone. And that can make our job a little bit tricky if we are relying solely on looking at an ultrasound and seeing a big follicle to do our timing for our, because a follicle alone does not predict the suitability of the breeding. So we could end up accidentally breeding that mare during diestrus when she's not in heat, when she's not in season. And of course, at that point, she's going to be under the influence of progesterone. And we go back to the issue of the immune function not being present and ending up with a lot of unpleasant things going on in the uterine environment as a result. So FSH responsible, follicle stimulating hormone responsible for promoting follicular growth. And in some cases, especially in the height of the breeding season, the natural breeding season, you can see a biphasic action and two hormonal actions there, creating two waves of. The other hormone that we're looking at there, which is the green line, is luteinizing hormone, LH. And this is a word where we can kind of glean an idea of what it does, because the luteinizing hormone is responsible for promoting the production of the corpus luteum, the CL. So luteinizing hormone, corpus luteum. But interestingly, the LH also is encouraging the final maturation of the developing follicle that's going to go on and ovulate, and actually promoting the ovulatory process. So right now in the northern hemisphere, we're in March here, and we're in a time of the year known as transitional. And transitional phase can be very, very frustrating because you can see a fairly good number of follicles on the ovary that don't ovulate. Your mares may be in estrus, they're in heat, they're receptive to the stallion, you could go ahead and breed them, but she doesn't ovulate. And obviously, if she doesn't ovulate, she's not going to. And that is because early in the transitional phase, although your FSH levels will elevate, luteinizing hormone, LH levels will not elevate. And so you don't get that final little push to achieve the ovulation. So that's a very brief profile of our hormonal axis. And if we look at the LH again on the next chart that you got there, the LH and FS, see that in a moment.
This one.
That's so we can see the response. So nature is saying, okay, our day of ovulation, day 0, mare may or may not have been bred. So if she hasn't been bred or if she hasn't got pregnant, we need to think about developing follicle the next breeding process or the next period of time when she could be bred, the next estrus. So you see that increase in FSH, which peaks somewhere around day 8 to day 10 in that inter-ovulation time frame of diestrus when the mare is not in heat. And it plateaus there for a few days. And if you look at a mare's ovaries on ultrasound in that time frame, you very commonly find multiple small follicles. And by small follicles, we're typically referencing something under 2 centimeters. And then over the course of the next few days, a magical process occurs whereby one of those follicles, sometimes more than one, but one of those follicles, we hope anyway, will be picked to be a dominant follicle. And that dominant follicle will go on to develop and ultimately go ahead and ovulate. And the other follicles there will regress and disappear. We're not completely sure of what makes one follicle a dominant follicle and the one right next to it one that's going to regress. But what we do know is that once a dominant follicle has been picked, the FSH levels will drop because, of course, FSH has done its job. It's promoted the development of that follicle. And then over the course of the next few days, the follicle itself will grow and develop that estrogen that we already talked. In response to the elevated estrogen levels and some other hormones is secreted at the same time frame, especially inhibin, the remaining follicles, as you can see with that lower line with the red blobs on, or sorry, the yellow blobs on, and those are regressing. So a mare is born with a significant number of follicles on her ovaries, anywhere from about 36,000 to 60,000 has been said. And obviously, not all of those are ever going to go ahead and ovulate. The vast majority of them will either not develop at all or develop and then regress. So a huge number of those never actually get to the point of ovulation. So we already mentioned the LH elevating just before ovulation, a matter of the last few days of the actual heat phase, and then peaking just after ovulation to promote the production of that corpus luteum, which is a structure which, remember, goes on to produce progesterone being the hormone that's going to encourage a lack of receptivity to the stallion and other pregnancy-like behaviors and so that's your hormones. A little bit boring, and that's a brief overview. But actually, when you start to get knowing a little bit more about them, they're pretty fascinating. It is something that is worthwhile sitting down and trying to learn, because if you're breeding any number of myths, the knowledge of the various hormones and where they appear in the cycle and what they do becomes absolutely invaluable for knowing what you should be doing as a manager of those mares and what you can and can't do. So very, very useful information rather than just kind of going randomly and relying solely on teasing or ultrasounds or whatever. Just knowing what your hormones are doing and where they are can be very, very useful. So let's go ahead and look at the possibility of manipulating the cycle, because we do have the availability of various hormones we can use in these mares to alter what they are naturally producing. And before we get heavily into manipulating them, let's consider why we would want to manipulate them. Well, the first thing would be simply if you're trying to get a mare bred midweek, for example, with transported. Now, it's a well-known fact that mares with transported semen only ever ovulate on the weekends. That's a given. Or holidays, July the 4th, great time for mares to ovulate, almost guaranteed. Because, of course, you don't have FedEx or UPS deliveries at that point, so you can't get semen. So really frustrating. But being able to manipulate that cycle so that you can perhaps get a midweek ovulation could be a very useful time. Other ways you might want to manipulate it, for example, for ET, for embryo transfer, if you're trying to synchronize so that they're going to ovulate very closely to each other, your donor mare and your recipient. If you're breeding multiple mares to the same stallion, even if you're breeding live cover, it can be useful to have them all very close to ovulation at the same point so you can load them on the trailer and take them to the stallion farm. Or if you're dealing with transported semen, you can maybe get one shipment of semen in and split it, or get 2 doses and split between 2 mares and save yourself some shipping expense, collection and shipping. So a variety of ways that can be very useful to be able to manipulate those cycles. Very useful. Now, it is important to be aware of the fact that when we get into manipulating cycles, the hormones that we're going to use are the same hormones that appear in human. So I always put up this slide that Ty is going to put up any second, I know, as a warning when I'm lecturing on this, because it's very, very easy to accidentally cause chaos with a woman's cycles in particular as a result of the hormones that we are using in the equine. So progesterone or the synthetic progestins such as altrinogest, which is the active ingredient in Regimate, which is very commonly, and estrogens are actually both hormones that appear in the human reproductive cycle. In fact, the human birth control pill is progesterone and estrogen. That's what it's made up of. So obviously one needs to be cautious when messing around with this. It is important when you're handling Regimate, as many people are already aware, to make sure that you wear protective. And latex is not, you have to wear a nitrile. Latex will not prevent the passage of that Regimate. And in fact, the Regimate will soak through the latex more easily than it will go into your, or rather it will go into your skin more easily than soaking through the latex. So what happens is once it's soaked through the latex and it's sitting adjacent to your skin, it'll go into the skin and into your body more easily than back through the latex. So you've actually created a Regimate patch for yourself, if you will. So you need to be very cautious about it. And then we'll have people that say, well, we always get my husband or my boyfriend or a male to do the Regimate. Well, it's not only going to have a negative impact on it. There are other situations that can impact males as well, thrombosis situations, heart problems, various cancers, things like that. So both estrogen and progesterone, you need to be very cautious when handling them. When we get into prostaglandins, which is very commonly used to so-called short cycle mare, that it works by destroying the corpus luteum, by lysing the CL, as we already. So the corpus luteum in the human, because humans have corpus luteum, is what also produce progesterone, and progesterone in the human also maintains. So women that are trying to get pregnant, I think they may be pregnant, should not be handling prostaglandins. And additionally, anyone, male or female, that has asthma should not be handling prostaglandins because it can what's happily termed significant negative cardiac function, or to put it another way, it stops. And that can be very bad for one. And that is particularly related to respiratory issues with asthma. So the Riot Act has now been read, and we can move on from there and look at prostaglandins, which are probably the most commonly used short cycling hormone. It's easy. It has a fairly good success rate, but it's not without its failings. And this is where one of those myth situations arise when people give a mare a shot at prostaglandin and she doesn't come into estrus. She doesn't come. And they say, oh, I used it on my mare, but it didn't. Well, it may not have worked, or it may have done some other things. The first thing to be aware of with prostaglandins is it's very important that there is a functional and receptive CL for that prostaglandin to potentially destroy the functioning. So if the mare has ovulated within about the last 5 days or so, she's not necessarily going to have a CL that is receptive to that prostaglandin. And the end result of that is a few days later, that CL is going to become fully functional and go on to secrete that progesterone, which maintains the mare not in heat, in diestrus. So at that point, people say, well, I gave my mare prostaglandin, but it didn't. So another way that prostaglandin may persuade you that it didn't work is if there's a large follicle. When you give the prostaglandin, it can actually rapidly promote the ovulation of that large follicle. Now, when we talk about large, we're talking about in particular anything over 2 centimeters. And if you give prostaglandin to a mare with a 2 centimeter follicle present, then you may see her come into estrus in perhaps a couple of days, as opposed to the more normal 3 to 5 day interval that you would expect. And if she comes into estrus in a couple of days, she may ovulate in a couple more days. So you could see her ovulate in perhaps 4 or 5 days, rather than just entering estrus in that 4 or 5 days and potentially remaining in estrus until she reaches the point of ovulation, which could be another 4 or 5 days, which is what you would normally. On average, the interval from giving prostaglandin and assuming everything is correct as far as receptive CL is present is about 7.5 to 9.5 days to the point of ovulation. That's the time frame one normally anticipates. But if you've got these large follicles, you can see it happen a lot more rapidly. So what do you do if you have a large follicle and you do, for some reason, give this mare prostaglandin and she does return to estrus very rapidly? And if the follicle is larger than 3 centimeters in diameter, you may even see mares come into heat in a matter of a few hours or less than a day and ovulate within 24 to 40 hours. So do you go ahead and breed those mares? Well, theoretically, you could. The problem is if a mare comes into estrus and ovulates rapidly, then she will typically have a distinctly reduced pregnancy. There's research that's demonstrated that reduction is about 50%. So if you're normally anticipating, and the average is 60% per cycle pregnancy rate, and you have a rapid ovulation, then you may end up with only about a 25 to 30% chance of getting that mare pregnant. So it's a significant. If you were to not breed on that cycle, but short cycle her again, having gone through that cycle with a rapid ovulation, and then breed her on the subsequent cycle, presuming she comes back into heat in a normal, you would actually be ahead of him as far as establishing a pregnancy compared to breeding her and then having to wait your 14 days or so to discover that she's not actually pregnant, and waiting another 4 or 5 days before you can go ahead and breed her. So it's a decision you have to make at the time. In a perfect world, when you're using prostaglandin, you'd ultrasound the mare before you give her the prostaglandin, find out what's going on the ovaries, and then decide whether or not it's advisable to give the prostaglandin. Now, something else that's we see with prostaglandin, and it sort of falls in that myth area, although it's maybe not necessarily a myth area, but a lot of people aren't aware of. When we give a mare prostaglandin, a full dose of prostaglandin, it's very typical about half an hour to 45 minutes later that you see the mare break out in a major sweat and may even be a little bit cramped. And a lot of people can get worried at that point if they've never seen it before. The mare can look a little bit colicky even, and they might even call their vet and say, hey, I gave my mare this shot and now she's colicking. What am I going to do? And the vet starts laughing at them when he discovers that you've given him prostaglandin. You're thinking, well, that's very rude. Here's my poor horse on death's doorstep and you're laughing at me. Well, it's actually a perfectly normal reaction to that huge dose of prostaglandin. If we look at our chart here for the prostaglandin, we see a spike of prostaglandin there, but that rise in the prostaglandin level actually starts somewhere around 12 or 13 days after the previous ovulation. And the spike occurs over a period of a couple of days as a result of sort of a compound effect, a gradual increase, slight decrease, increase, decrease. It's not just one big bolus that suddenly gets released. It's a gradual release of prostaglandin from the uterus that results in this mare's destruction of the cell. You don't walk out in the field and look at your mares and say, oh, look, there's Bessie. She's sweating like crazy. She must be about to come into estrus in a couple of days. That's not how it's. So interestingly, as far back as 1970, when prostaglandins were first being used and developed for returning mares to estrus, Dr. Bob Douglas and Dr. Ginter, who were the two researchers who did the work on that in Italy, determined that they could actually use a very, very low dose of prostaglandin to cause these mares to return to estrus. And then when the drug was going through the approval process for that actual dosage was increased with the intent of sort of being absolutely sure that they got a positive response. With the end result that today it's very common with the Dynaprost, such as Lutalice or those types of products, to give as much as 2 mils or 10 milligrams of Dynaprost, which is a huge dose as far as the mare is concerned, and results in you can actually significantly reduce that dosage down to 1/10 of whatever that dose is that you would normally give. And with the Dynaprost, which is sort of more of a native prostaglandin, you do need to give the dose 2 days in a row, but 1/10 of the dose 2 days in a row. And you'll see the same return to estrus, assuming everything else is in place, without any of those unpleasant signs. And if you're using a synthetic prostaglandin, such as cloprostanol, which is marketed as Estimate, which incidentally is not approved for use in horses, it's actually a bovine drug, you can get away with 1/10 dose because the half-life is significantly. So if you don't get anything else out of this podcast, I think your mares may be a little bit happier, not having to go through the unpleasant side effects that you sometimes see with those mares by reducing. So 1/10 of the dose, and that's been published multiple times since the original work by Douglas and it was presented again, looked at in 2002 at the International Symposium on Equine Reproduction, and Dr. Orish and a team in Vienna have looked at it since then and found the same thing. So reducing that dosage can certainly save your mares. So the next hormone that's very commonly used to bring these mares into a timely the progestin group, and progesterone, or the synthetic progestin, altrinogest, marketed as. And a very common protocol for this is to give the mare 8 to days to 10 days of the oral, and then on the last day you give prostaglandin. The only problem with these progestins is, remember that progestins in the mare naturally don't guarantee suppression of ovarian activity and the follicular development. Remember that biphasic action of FSH, especially in the height of the summer and the height of the breeding. So although Regimate and the other various progestin products that you can get may suppress follicular development, it's not guaranteed. And that can lead to a situation where at the end of the time frame for the treatment, you may have a large follicle already. So if you give prostaglandin on day 10, for example, you may see a rapid onset of estrus and a rapid ovulation, just as you did when you saw prostaglandin used by. Or alternatively, the mare could even ovulate within the last day or two of the Regimate or progestin treatment period, with the end result that when you give that prostaglandin on the 10th day, which is a normal part of the process, instead of getting that CL destroyed, is not yet receptive to the prostaglandin, and consequently 3 to 5 days later, when you're expecting the mare to come into estrus, she doesn't, because the CL is now fully functional and secreting progesterone. So there are areas where progestin therapy or progestin treatment can not result in the return to estrus that one would normally anticipate as well, which can be very, very frustrating. So a better combination is actually using the hormone combination progesterone and estradiol. Now, this isn't, that's our regular progestins there we go, our P&E treatment. So this is a tremendous combination that's actually been around for many, many years. Loyan Pemstein came up with it, and Professor Lofstad worked on it back in the 1980s. But it's not widely known outside the reproductive specialist circles, is probably the best way to put it. The people that are doing a lot of research or are doing a lot of reproductive work will be, but your average veterinarian very often isn't aware of the P&E protocol. And the reason for that is there's no commercially available progesterone and estradiol. And because it's a compounded product, it can't be advertised. And because it can't be advertised, veterinarians can open up their various journals and they see a full-page ad for progestins, for Regimate and Pila, and they see that, but they're not going to see a full-page ad for P&E. So they don't become aware of it unless they're in that specialized. So P&E is wonderful because the estrogen portion of that combination suppresses ovarian activity. And the end result is that when you give this, either for daily for 10 days, which is the older protocol, or now there's a bio-release formulation, which releases that combination over about a 10 day. On that 10th day, you get a tremendously positive rebound effect of FSH and then subsequently LH. And the end result is you get a very predictable response to the point where the vast majority of mares will have a return to estrus and be ready to be bred on about day 18 or day 19 of the entire protocol, from the time they initially receive that treatment until the time. So it can be very, very useful indeed in many situations. Again, we get back to why we were trying to mess around with our mare cycles. And one is synchronizing mares for either embryo transfer or because you're breeding to multiple mares to the same state. So tremendously valuable in that. Again, it's not something that's commercially available, so you have to go to a compounding. And the compounding pharmacies have to know the correct formulation. We personally like to use Bat Farm. We've had good success with their products. And this gives us a 10-day dosage biorelease formulation, which releases that P&E over the 10 period. There's also a biorelease altrinogest, which has more or less the same effect. And then we know that the vast majority of these cases, and by vast majority, I'm talking 90% is what's been shown in the research, will return to estrus in a timely manner. And then when they're manipulated again with an ovulation agent, you can anticipate that 90% of those mares are going to ovulate within a certain time. So in fact, you will see somewhere around 80% of these mares ovulating quite literally to the day on day 19, if you manipulate both of those factors, both the actual timing of the cycle and the timing of the ovulation. So very, very useful indeed. Now, there is it. And that is, depending on where you happen to be listening to this, you may not be able to access this combination because although P&E is available in North America and in Australia and in New Zealand, certain countries in the world, notably Europe and the UK, do not permit the use of estrogens in animals. And as a consequence, you can't get P&E. So unfortunately, you won't be able to use that protocol if you happen to be living in one of those countries. But outside that, certainly a useful protocol to use. Something else that's sometimes used, not as widely in North America, interestingly, but is used in Great Britain, United Kingdom, and in Australia and New Zealand, is a progesterone releasing intravaginal device. And this gives a slightly better control than even Regimate in some instances because it's put into the mare's vagina. It's used in cattle in North America, but for some reason it's never caught on with the equine world. And it controlled releases over a period of time. So like injectables or orals, which are given daily, you don't see the fluctuation of those. And that can be a useful tool. So that's something that's actually available from your feed stores in many instances. Depending on what state you're living in, you may require a prescription. And that can be a useful way of giving these mares the progestins rather than having to use the oral version or an injectable version. So both additional but not widely used manipulation. So those are some of the more common manipulation methods we use, some of the pitfalls. Hopefully we've talked a little bit about some of the myths that we see, especially that which often gets targeted, oh, I used it, but it didn't work. And now perhaps we understand why it might not have worked in some. So that's about it, I guess. Have you got any questions, Ty?
Well, it's a lot of information. And the only thing that I think of is your average lay person that hasn't been exposed to this type of information and being able to absorb it and then apply it to their everyday, breeding. Like, what is your recommendation to getting more information and being able to be better equipped for things like the myth information that you talk?
Well, yeah, as you say, it's a lot to try and digest at one go. So getting an additional or alternative source of information where you can sit down and read it or of course, the podcast will be available, which will be helpful. You can go over it again and again. But the internet is, of course, the big source of information these days. But as we're all too well aware, it depends entirely where you go on the internet as to whether you're going to get good information or sketchy information, or in some cases, bad. So peer-reviewed journals are always a good source of information. So publications that are peer-reviewed are going to give you that information. It can be a little dry reading at times because they're designed to produce and provide the scientific information, which, although a veterinarian may find of value, a lot of breeders may look at and go, wow, this is way too complicated. So going to other places for that information, obviously, our website, we've got a variety of different information on there, equine-reproduction.com, and we've got articles on there. that address a lot of this. In fact, a lot of the images that you've seen have been on the Equine Repro Facebook group, is a Facebook group that we manage ourselves, and that has a lot of excellent people on there, a lot of researchers, a lot of people that have done peer-reviewed publications, but are more than happy to share that information at more of a breeder level, which can be tremendously. For veterinarians, there is a fairly new website, veterinarians and researchers, I should say, not just veterinarians, but certainly your PhDs and your PhD candidates and students and vets. And that is the International Symposium on Equine Reproduction's educational website, which has a tremendous selection of works. And that's available at iser.vetpd.com. And that's a tremendously good website. It is a subscription site, but they have reached publications there in a webinar format by some of the world's leading researchers and veterinarians. So for somebody that's in the professional field, that's going to be a very valuable source of info. So look at where it's coming from is kind of the key thing. If it looks too good to be true, it might. So look at the source and determine whether or not you feel it's a responsible source or whether it's just yet another.
No, that's awesome. I appreciate all the information, and I'm sure there's going to be tons of questions that'll be sent to me, and I'll probably just forward it straight to you to answer, or I'll direct them to your Facebook group, which is very impressive in size and in the, I would say, the diversity of people that are on there. It's an open, honest conversation. It's wide range. Like I said, it's very diverse. So people that are just brand new into the breeding, and I would say very seasoned and tenured breeders that are on there. So I do recommend everybody go to the Facebook group. Can you share what the Facebook group name is?
It's Equine Pro, and there is a link to it. There's a page on our website that has it. Or if you go to Facebook, of course, you can simply go ahead and do a search for Equine Repro there, and it'll come up. And in a second, I will actually give you the URL if you want that. Just give me a second here, because I need to go and look it up myself, because, of course, I just normally click on it. And it is going to be on facebook.com/groups, GROUPS, /equine, EQUINE, and then all one word, repro, REPRO. And the E and the R are both capitalized, although I'm not sure that necessarily makes a difference. So facebook.com/groups/equine repro, and that will get you. When you go to, there are 3 questions that need to be answered, and adherence to the group rules agreed to. If you don't answer the 3 questions, then the team that manages the membership won't approve it. We fight hard to not have spammers and unpleasant people. So answering those 3 questions is very, very important indeed to ensure that you are legitimate. So we'd ask you to do that. And certainly mention in your application, I saw it on the Botu Pharma podcast, and that certainly will help us to know where you came from. And even if some of your answers are a little bit weird and we raise our eyebrows, then we know that you are legit after all. So please go ahead and do that.
Awesome. Yes. And I do recommend Joss and his wife Kathy's shorts. If you're interested in packing in more information in a short amount of time, it's a 3-day program where you're literally hands-on and hands-in the aspect. So I do recommend those short courses. You've got another one coming up later this year, I believe.
We probably actually won't have one until next spring. We typically hold them at the beginning of the breeding season. So we always ponder doing it in the fall, but our experience in the fall is the vast majority of people at that point are so relieved not to be breeding anymore that they really want to forget about everything until the next spring. So usually sort of February, March is when we put them on. So we just had one last weekend or 2 weekends, maybe 3 weekends ago. Time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah, and with that, I again, thank you for being on the podcast. I'm sure I'll have other topics for you, and depending on the reception of the podcast, maybe we'll bring you back on. But as always, thank you, my friend, and you have a good day.
Well, thanks very much indeed for having me, and I hope it's helpful for everybody. And yeah, questions, please don't hesitate. We're more than happy to answer.
Sounds great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening.